Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. So, on behalf of Sexto Piso Publishing House, thank you very much to everyone for being here. Thank you to Robert Kolker for being here with us to introduce the Spanish version of his book, Los Chicos of Hidden Valley Road in Spanish. And thanks to Nacho Carretero, he's a writer and a journalist. He's a very well-known journalist here in Spain. Thanks to Espacio Fundación Telefónica for having us. And, we are going to watch a conversation about this book. I would just like to say that on behalf of the publishing house, it's a privilege and a matter of joy to have this book in our catalog. As I've said, it is a story that is amazing from the journalistic point of view, from the research and literature point of view. So without further ado, I give the floor to you. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you.
Bueno, pues muchas gracias a todos.
Okay, so thank you very much to everyone. Thanks to Robert. Thanks for counting on me for the presentation, because normally presentations, what I usually do, I'm listening to myself. I'm sorry. I usually prepare the presentation. I've also prepared this one, but I use the book to see what can I ask this person, etc. And in this case, things were really things emerged. This is a piece of work that any reporter, any journalist feels envy of seeing. Well, it's great to find this story here. So, as I was reading the book, before starting the book, I had like 10 questions, and as I moved on, I had around 100. These are just a matter of curiosity. I would ask them, although we weren't here, this presentation, although there was nobody here, I would overwhelm you with questions, because I really want to speak about how you came to this story, the method you used, and if there's time, and if you want, we can compare how this kind of work works between, in Spain or in the US, because sometimes we have a lack of time, lack of means, lack of support, and it is really difficult sometimes to face such humongous works as the one that you have faced in this case. So I'm going to be very brief, because what I know is to give the floor to the author, to Robert, but I would summarize in 2 sentences what this book has meant to me. It's a journalistic story that I think that has the elements that every report should have, every journalistic report. I mean, it is really eye-striking. We have a unique context, we have an atmosphere that as a reader you deep dive in it directly, and we have journalism. You'll learn. I mean, there's information, there's even a didactic tone sometimes. So you end up the book with a feeling of having read a really complete work. There's a way of writing, by the way, that I'm fascinated about this. It's a way of writing that is easy, I say. I usually say that to write good, it's easy, but to write clear and simple is really difficult. And I think that there's clarity, there's a very straightforward style that makes you feel engaged with the story, and besides this clarity and this style, the author has a distance, and this is something that I particularly like. I mean, there's nothing against first person. There are many people that don't like it, but I would say that I usually like when the author sets aside and tells a story. And I think that this is quite obvious that this happens. And the story is heavy enough, so to speak, so that the author offers his reflections in an indirect way and a very organic way and with subtlety, and not reflections that maybe could interrupt the story. And in this case, it is something that I would like to highlight of this book. So I wouldn't like to flatter you very much since the very beginning, so I would like to ask you about some things. I would like to say something else, by the way, and this is about style. These chronicles, I mean, it seems that you're reading a novel, and in this case, I would like to speak about this with you. it seems that it's magic realistic novel. Sometimes it looks like a Latin American novel by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, 12 siblings, where some things have happened. If we didn't know that it is a journalistic work, we wouldn't believe it. For example, a lady sewing falcon's eyes while his child is having a bath with beer. I mean, it is a journalistic chronicle, and you say, well, this looks like a novel. It is amazing. So my first question, Bob, is about how did you come to this story? I mean, I know that this is a case, well, you've told me that a similar case has been discovered in Costa Rica, but every case is a unique case from a clinical point of view. 6 members of the same family have schizophrenia, and it emerges there were no precedents. So how did you come to this case? And especially, once you came across this case, what door did you knock on? The first door you knocked on in order to try to get into this world?
Thank you for that question, and thank you for everything, Nacho. This is a wonderful introduction. And before I answer, I'll just say thank you to all of you for coming and for the chance to have a conversation with you. Hopefully there'll be time for questions at the end. And I want to thank the publishers, Sexto Piso. The entire team here has been hardworking and wonderful, and I've had a lovely day today here in Madrid, having lots of conversations with people. This family came to me through a friend. The friend was an old editor of mine who knew the sort of work that I had done recently, was focusing on families in crisis, on everyday people undergoing something extraordinary. I worked for many years writing magazine articles for New York Magazine and other places, and over time I became the person who they would not send me to interview the mayor or a movie star or an athlete or a fashion designer. They would send me to the person who never imagined that they would ever get press coverage, who is vulnerable and scared or upset or angry or caught up in something very complicated. And the privilege of doing this sort of journalism is that at the magazine length, you can write it as a narrative. You can employ storytelling techniques like novelists. So I don't think I'm like as good as Marquez, but the ambition is to do what people in this industry have done for the last 30 or so years, people like Tom Wolfe and Joan Didion and so forth. This is the ambition. I wrote a book about 5 families in crisis. It was a true crime book called Lost Girls. And so my friend came to me and said, I know of a family that went through an amazing crisis. I went to high school with a young woman who was the youngest of 12 children, and 6 of her brothers had schizophrenia, and they were studied by science. And they have a story to tell. And I said, I just started a new job. This sounds incredibly sad. I don't know anything about schizophrenia. I'm one of those journalists who tells you why I can't do the story, the 10 reasons right off the bat. And he said, just get on the phone with them and get to know them. So I had a phone call with the young woman and her sister. These are the only 2 girls in the family, the youngest people in the family. They were very excited to be talking to a journalist. They had decided after many, many years that talking to an independent journalist about their family was the way to go. They had not been written up anywhere else. They were not public about it. And in fact, all of the scientific studies that the family participated in were all using their data anonymously. So it's not as if they were a famous case that you would learn about in medical school or anything like that. So they were very much under the radar, and it was not immediately clear to me whether it would be scientifically significant. They certainly were on a personal level. It's an amazing story, but what meaning would it have to society? That was one big question I had. The other question I had was whether the others in the family were as interested in talking about these difficult subjects as the sisters were. I was skeptical. And so I moved very slowly, and I didn't go to publishers with this book idea until I had been in touch with them for more than a year, and actually gone to visit Colorado across the country and met people in person, and really had an understanding with them that I would be independent, but also that they were willing and interested in being candid about their lives. And once they all showed an interest in this, I turned around completely, and I became very excited because I had been doing lots of reading about schizophrenia and talking with experts and doctors about severe mental illness, and I learned that this family was they did represent a great hope for doctors in the 1980s who were trying to play detective and find the genetic roots of schizophrenia. And the more I read about this illness, the more mysterious it seemed, and the more I saw that a book like this simply did not exist. There were wonderful memoirs and essay collections about personal experiences with mental illness, and wonderful books like at the Oliver Sacks kind of level, where an expert is writing amazingly well-written, stories about science, but nobody had written about a family story. Nobody had gotten inside the heads of everybody in one large family and told the story over decades. I started to think about the book as something like a big family saga that spanned more than one generation, something like East of Eden or The Corrections or something like that. I got very ambitious and very excited. And so by the time I went to publishers with it, I knew that I would need a lot of time. This is to your question, Nacho, about how much time would it take. I knew this wouldn't be a book about I didn't want it to be a very quick book about an interesting scientific case study that I could write quickly. I wanted to spend a year or two on it. And I was fortunate because I had already written one book before, Lost Girls, and it was critically received well. So I came in with a track record, and so that meant that publishers came to me with a deal that allowed me to leave my job and work full-time on this for 2 years. And that's the way I was able to do it. So it was a tremendous privilege, and it was exciting for me as someone who had been in the trenches writing weekly magazine journalism for really 20 years before this moment. So it was really the challenge of a career, but also an exciting moment in my career.
Bueno, antes no lo dije, pero...
Well, I didn't say this before, but both Bob and myself want you to feel free, okay? If you want to take the floor, if you want to ask any questions, although we have a Q&A session at the end. If you have something that you have to spit it out, please interrupt us. So, I'll go back to the book, but you've touched a topic that is really interesting for me as a journalist, as an author of a couple of books, by the way. And it is about the conditions you worked. You had the privilege of working on this for 2 years, and I know through other US colleagues what we see from Spain, that sometimes in the US you have the circumstances that allow a reporter to work exclusively on a story for 2 years and to publish the book subsequently. Equally, Bob is one of these examples of reporters that we admire in the US, and he publishes reports in New York Times magazines, and that's amazing for any journalist. So here in Spain, and I would like to take advantage to launch this complaint, so to speak. We have some kind of we have some problems here. If you find any story here like this one in Spain, any journalist would have to combine this with his work at his company, or to be hungry. These would be the two alternatives that he would have when writing such a story. Do you think that this is a determining factor? I mean, sometimes I think that if maybe the media were different, maybe journalism could go one step forward, and we could find more stories here in Spain or in other European countries that could be compared to the great stories that come from the US. Up to what extent you think that this scenario that you can work on determines the results of the work, and you feel that sometimes you have this privilege of being able to work, not every journalist, but many journalists have the possibility of working in these conditions?
It is one of the great paradoxes of being a journalist today, that the barrier to entry is lower than ever. Like, we could all go on right now on our phones and write a story and publish it for the world to see, but that the economics of the industry are continuing to collapse. They've been collapsing for decades, but they continue to collapse. And so it's difficult to have the time and the space sometimes to develop an idea. One of the greatest narrative nonfiction books that I can think of is called Random Family. It's by Adrienne Nicole LeBlanc. It came out, I think, in 2005 or so. But this is a woman who spent 10 years with her subjects, and she basically did it by getting grants from charitable foundations, one after the other, that kept her able to put food on the table, and then she would crash on her friends' couches instead, so that she wouldn't pay the rent. And then she writes this book that is the book of a lifetime, and things hopefully become easier for her. But that's not an ideal situation. I do know that in New York, at least, there's an opportunity where you can write something short that is compelling, and then that becomes almost like the selling document that you bring to a book agent or to a publisher and say, what if I made this into a book? And then you ideally, you make a deal with a publisher, and then you knock on your boss's door and you say, good news, I'm going to go write a book now. Can you do without me for a period of time? And that's what happened with me with Lost Girls. That originally was a magazine article. I'm reading something now that'll be out next year that's based on a series of articles that were in the Wall Street Journal. These are working reporters who need to work to put food on the table, but then they find something that's bigger than what they can do, and they find a way to get the book going.
Volviendo al libro,
So going back to the book, one of the feelings that it conveyed in a more intense way, and I don't know if anybody in the audience agrees with me, is that feeling of that overwhelming feeling, that I would say that disquiet, that restlessness because of schizophrenia, and especially when a family has to live together, because although it's true that you speak, I mean, in the more didactic part, so to speak, that there's some kind of anomaly in CHRNR7, and we know more than what was known by the time. I think that we have much room for improvement, of course, and especially there's a point. I said restlessness because I think that there's a point of being overwhelmed because you really don't understand what's going on. I mean, there's no established protocol. If I have schizophrenia, this will happen and the behavior will be this one. So it is rather great dark space. It's some kind of dark space, and the response of who suffers it can be any. And this was a feeling that I had throughout the book, and I don't know if this happened to you, and if you share this opinion about how overwhelming such a disease can be.
It really consumed their lives. I wanted to make two big points in telling the family story. The first was that the boys who became sick weren't monsters. It wasn't like an Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where one after the other they become lost. They were people who got sick, and I wanted to write about them as people. I thought that the story was horrifying enough that I didn't have to lean into that and write a spooky story about a family living a nightmare. I thought it spoke for itself, and why not talk about these people like they're actually people. And then the second thing is I wanted to write about the experience of the Wells siblings too, because everything in their youth, everything in their childhood became oriented around this uncertainty. What was going to happen today? Who was going to need help today? Who was going to get sick today? Will I be the one to get sick today? And even today, the six Wells siblings have they're very nice people, and if you ran into them at a party or the supermarket, you'd have a lovely time talking with them. But they do have a certain hypervigilance. They're ready for something to change because they had that was their childhood. So I wanted to get that across, and I also wanted to show how they processed that trauma, how they moved into adulthood and changed their opinion of their family. The big question I had was, why did this family stay together? Why didn't Lindsay and Margaret, the sisters, why didn't they just leave town and go to law school, get a job somewhere else, send a Christmas card every year, and be done with it? But the privilege and the luxury of a long book like this is I could talk about how they came around and decided to come back to their family on their own terms slowly. So Lindsay at the age of 17 is different from Lindsay at 23 and 33 and 43. She changes, and it's exciting just from a craft perspective as a reporter to be able to write about someone's life that way.
Una de las cosas que me...
One of the things that the book made me think of was the work process that you followed in order to approach such a private and delicate case, because this is part of the deepest privacy of a family. I always believe that you need time to gain the trust of who's going to tell the story. In this case, you can't arrive there and to ask them, "Hey, quickly, tell me, how did you brother torture cats?" For example, no, you need to gain that trust. I would like you to tell us how you accomplished this trust. I feel that with Mary, the younger sister, you had an important level of trust, and I think that a lot of information came from her. But how did you get that trust? How did you make this family want to share this story with you?
On a tighter deadline, trying to file for a magazine article, there are certain shorthand things you could do to try to telegraph trust. You know, dress nicely and try to project a certain calmness, and you make it clear to them that you're not going to run away and never see them again. You make it clear that you're a professional who's in the business and who can be relied on. But with a book like this, that's just the beginning. And so when I look back on it, I think what I did was that the first round of talking with all of them, I did very little talking and just listened to what was on their minds. This was important because we're talking about things that happened so long ago that it's possible that some of them had been rehearsing in their minds the sort of thing they would say to someone like me. And so why not let them say it? And then the second round, once I got to know them better, would be to try to nail down the chronology, because in assembling a story with 12 children and 2 parents, with so much of it happening long ago, and there are no police reports left; those were destroyed. There's very little factual record to go on except for hospital records. I had to talk with each of them about what happened when, and the act of doing that actually creates even more trust, because it makes it clear to them that I'm working very, very hard to get it right. And then in that third round, that's when the deeper conversations can happen. You know, how did it feel when Donald came home from the hospital? What was every day like? You know, what do you remember? There was a time where he ripped a phone out of the wall. Where were you when that happened? To start to really ask the less comfortable stuff. I will say, while on paper the book looked very, very difficult, the act of interviewing all of the people in this book was simpler than a lot of other work I've done because they were willing, and because it happened so long ago. Everybody answered every question I asked. I can't think of a moment where I asked a question and someone said, "I'm uncomfortable talking about that." They were happy to have the conversations.
Bueno, es que en realidad esta pregunta la tenía por...
Well, this question was for later on, but I think it really fits with what you've just said. And there's a feeling of satisfaction that I'm sure you felt when you gained this trust, the journalistic satisfaction of realizing that you are getting into the story, that you are getting the material to explain it. But I guess that this should entail more private and personal satisfaction, and as a consequence, a responsibility, because you were talking about a family that went through very tough moments. So was this a burden for you at any time? I mean, did you have that feeling of a responsibility that what you had in your hands was more than any journalistic story?
There is a responsibility when you're writing about vulnerable people. Absolutely. It's an area of journalism that is more popular these days, to write about people in trouble, whether it's refugees or people who are sick from COVID-19. It's an interesting category because on one hand, you want to be a traditional journalist. You don't, let's assume for the moment that you don't want to be an advocacy journalist where you're carrying the flag for these people and saying, who will pay attention and someone needs to help them. You want to be a little bit more neutral in your position. But at the same time, you're not reporting on Watergate, right? You're not out to find good guys and bad guys. You're out to explore issues and talk about how things feel. And so that means that your approach does have an element of empathy and compassion. You're trying to understand things. Where it runs into trouble is that if you are approaching practically everyone from a position of understanding, the people who disagree with one another start to be upset that the other person got the same treatment that they got, and that's where things can get sticky. But if you keep your head up and show that you're making an earnest effort to understand anyone, then it's a better path, I've found. It's weird because I avoided reporting as a younger person. I didn't come and become a reporter until my 20s. I wanted to be an arts critic or a movie reviewer. And that's because everyone I knew who wanted to be a journalist wanted to report on Watergate, or wanted to be a foreign correspondent, or be there with a microphone when the politician came off the plane. And that scared me to death. I felt it was too competitive, that there was no way to really do anything distinctive, that I'd just be racing and trying not to get fired. Whereas with the stories like these, talking with people and learning about them and getting to know them and telling it as a narrative, I felt like I had a unique thing to offer. So I've been pleased to be able to pursue that.
Y una vez que terminaste el trabajo,
and once you finish the work, or when you have some parts of the work, did you come to share it with you? Did they give you any feedback before publishing it?
This is interesting because typically, if you're a traditional journalist, you wouldn't share your work with your subjects. And so my plan was to not share the book with them until maybe a month before it came out, so that they could read it before the reviews came out. But then there was advance interest in the book, and there were publications like People magazine that wanted to interview them 6 months beforehand to get something together. And I thought, well, that's just not fair. It's not fair to ask them to be interviewed by People magazine about a book they haven't read yet. So I sent it to them a few months earlier than I planned to. And that meant that there was room for changes, technically. And that turned out to be a good thing because they corrected me on misspelling certain landmarks and things like that. And so that I was very happy about that. But it did lead to some pretty deep discussions with a couple of them who felt as if they had a smaller role in the book and someone else had a larger role in the book. And I think eventually everyone came around to appreciating the book because they saw that it was received as a well-intentioned book, not as a sensationalistic book, that it was supposed to help people. And so that meant that they ran into people in the supermarket who knew them and they would say, oh, your book is going to help so many people. And they would walk away and say, oh, I guess that's the case. And then, of course, Oprah Winfrey's book club chose it, and that added to that perception as well, which I'm incredibly grateful for.
Y ellos se han convertido en una familia.
Have they become into a more or less known family in the US after publishing the book?
Generado
I mean, it has generated media interest or journalistic interest.
There is an element of that. The house on Hidden Valley Road, no one from the family lives there anymore. They sold the house, I think, at least 5 years ago. And I did not put the address of the house in the book, but readers have found it and have come to the house to look at it. And they haven't knocked on the door, but they're there in the neighborhood. And the current owner of the house was alarmed and wondering, why is this happening? And that was something that nobody expected, to do that. And I had to sort of put out there on my website that no one from the family lives there anymore. Also, he renovated the house, so it doesn't really look the same anyway. Lindsay, the youngest of the Galvins, she's become a more public person. She's become an advocate for families with severe mental illness. She wants to help families that are like her family, who, particularly with sick family members who don't want help, who don't believe they're sick. So she's joined the boards of a couple of organizations and is speaking publicly about it. So she probably, in the years to come, may become more identified with this book than the others.
Y conectando con eso, es tremendo.
And the relationship with this, it's amazing, the relationship that I said. Do you think that, well, you said that she's helping families, etc. Do you think that this book can help speak out about this to make people aware of all this? I mean, did you have this intention? Because nowadays, a lot of things that are being said about mental health, it is something that has been, it seemed to be almost forbidden, and luckily it's being increasingly tackled. Do you think that your book can support this new stage of speaking about this kind of problems?
It's a very interesting moment, isn't it? I mean, you have Britney Spears talking about mental illness, and in tennis and in gymnastics they talk about the need for mental health and taking mental health breaks. And then in America, whenever there's a mass shooting, they ask, did the person have mental illness? They're questioning police tactics and engaging with the mental illness. And so it's all over the place. But the most encouraging thing is the concern that so many people have for children after the pandemic about how their mental health is. And I think about my years growing up, and if there was that kind of widespread concern for the mental health of kids as an open discussion, it might have been very beneficial. And this is no small point when it comes to schizophrenia, because as I try to explain later on in the book, people seem to understand now that it's a developmental disorder, which means the more you can do to protect and reinforce brain development at a young age, the better off you'll be if you happen to be unlucky enough to have a genetic vulnerability to schizophrenia.
Volviendo al libro,
So going back to the book, the way you write, how you tell story, I said that it was eye-catching to me, the fact that you took some distance. As narrator, you were almost invisible in the story. And you did not include reflections that, in some works like this one, are included by the authors, or they speak on their behalf. So was this something deliberate? I mean, did you think about this in order to get some distance? And in any case, did you feel that maybe it was better to appear in some way on the book? And you, in the sense of your process, how you communicate, how you get along, how you come to the family?
I've settled on an approach that is calm and unfussy, you know, with no big acrobatics, and no loud voice. I'm not making speeches, as you say. There's no interlude in there where I say, why did this happen, or anything like that. But at the same time, I'm trying to write as dramatically and vividly as possible about what people went through, and even the researchers to try and talk about what they're thinking and feeling and channel what they're experiencing, so that the emotional lives of the people are more important than any voice that I have. And that's an interesting line. The story I tell is when I was working on my first book, Lost Girls. It's a true crime book, right? So it's a murder mystery. So I sat down to write, and I thought, well, what am I doing here? Like, am I Elmore Leonard? Am I writing a down and dirty crime book, or am I a sober writer for the New York Times writing in a very quiet, mature way? And what I landed on was that the events in the book were so vivid and so dramatic and so eye-catching on their own that they didn't need a heavy narration, a heavy voice to try to dress them up. In fact, it made it sound bad the more heavy-handed I got with my voice. And the way I thought about it was, if you have an absolutely beautiful art collection, you don't paint your walls purple with polka dots. You know, you paint your walls white because you want the art collection to be what everybody is looking at, not the walls. So I try to keep in the background.
También quería preguntarte sobre...
I also wanted to ask you about what the fact of working on this story has contributed to you in terms of learning, not only about schizophrenia, that, well, I don't know if you had a very deep knowledge before, but I guess that you have discovered new information, but what has given this book to you? What lessons have you learned, and if it has changed the way you see some things after working on this story?
I think I always understood that the old saying that no child grows up in the same family as another child in the family, that you and your siblings, you actually have different parents and different families because you're in a different vantage point. But I really saw that in an amazing way by talking with 9 siblings in one family. Everybody has a very different take, including the mentally ill sons who are still alive. There are 3 of the 6. Everybody is talking about a different family when they talk. It's really amazing, really quite amazing. And that I take that with me. And then more importantly, from a mental health perspective, I live in New York City, where there's lots of homelessness and mental illness that I see on my street and everywhere else a lot. And I always thought of it as a public policy problem. I would see someone on the street who was disturbed, and I'd say, well, we need better policies, we need better funding, we need a system, we need a better mental health system to help these people, and it's really a shame. But now that I've worked on this book, I look at the people and I think of them more as people, each person having their own story. I think, you know, once upon a time, this person had a family. What happened there? How did they break away? Why are they on their own? Who still knows them? Who is someone looking for them? And I ask myself those questions more now.
Bueno, os insisto en que
Well, I insist. If you want to ask anything, please go ahead. So regarding the style, maybe it's a minor detail, but I've liked that there's some kind of scheme of the family before starting the story, and before every chapter there's some kind of indicator that there's a list of the siblings, and in bold you see the protagonist of that chapter, the sibling that is the protagonist of that chapter. It reminded me of the Buendia in 100 Years of Loneliness by Garcia Marquez, by the way, and there's a lot of magic realism, as I've said, because why do you use these schemes and these indicators before every chapter? Do you do this thinking of the reader, or maybe because it was difficult for you when you were writing, or maybe you were thinking, is this clear enough? Will this be a mess for the reader with the characters? Are you trying to be more clear, or is it just a matter of aesthetic, so to speak?
I did it because I was terrified. I was concerned that there were so many people in the book that readers wouldn't be able to keep them straight, and that they would get frustrated with the book and throw the book across the room and not pick it up again. So I thought to myself, is there a way? As I started to write the family story, I realized that it's not like every person is in the spotlight of every chapter. There is a chapter that is just about Michael and a chapter that is just about Margaret. And that's when it became clear to me, what if you had the cast of characters at the beginning of every chapter in the order of their ages, and just bold-faced whoever was going to be in the spotlight that chapter. It would be like the program of a play, so you know that in this scene, this is who is on stage. Or it would, the American thing would be like the program of a baseball game. You know that who's up at bat in the third inning. It's these people. It's their turn to be up at bat. And I was so happy. I was running around the house. I showed it to my kids. Look, I have this idea, because I felt like it really solved a problem potentially. And I still really adore it. I think it works nicely.
Bueno, imagino que ya muchos lo sabréis.
Well, I guess that many of you already know it, but there are two movies that have been shot, two if I'm mistaken, done based on Robert Kolker's work, and this is The Girls and Bad Education. And Bad Education, by the way, is based on one of your articles. I wanted to ask you two things. One that is more obvious about this book, but this will be after the first one, and this has to do with the relationship between the AV world, series, movies, etc., and journalism. This is quite a consolidated relationships in the US. It has been so for many years, and both industries, TV shows and the movie industry, really have a very intense look at the journalist work, and there are many movies and TV shows that are based not in a book but on a chronicle, for example, on an article, as I've said about Bad Education. Here in Spain, it is not that important, but in these last years we are seeing how the AV world is looking more intensely towards journalism. I would like you to talk about the experience when your works became into movies, and I would like to know your opinion about the fact of journalism and the AV world living together. But it seems that it's quite fruitful. What do you think about it?
I used to think about it in terms of a trend, because there would be, in my experience, a few years straight where Hollywood was suddenly optioning, selecting magazine articles based on true events because a certain movie did well, and then they trying to do like that, and so suddenly everybody's buying them, and then the trend goes away. When I first worked at New York Magazine, that there was somebody who had just sold her article for an amazing amount of money, and she was only 24 years old. So it was in the air. Like you're not going to get paid a lot in your job, but who knows? One day Hollywood could swoop down and make your article into a movie. And it didn't help that I worked at a place that published the story that became Saturday Night Fever, many decades earlier. And what's happened is, because of streaming and because of all the new demand for content and because of the popularity of long documentary streaming that are based on true events, suddenly it's a feeding frenzy bigger than anything that existed before. I'm not sure what's made it to Spain, but the Elizabeth Holmes story, the dropout about the scandal with Theranos, that's based on a Wall Street Journal reporter, writing. And the Anna Delvey, the young con artist that was on Netflix, that was based on a New York Magazine story. And Hustlers with Jennifer Lopez, that was based on so suddenly it feels real, like almost everybody might have something picked at any time. Now, of course, that trend might go away tomorrow, but Bad Education was based on a story that was published in 2004, and a small independent producer just grabbed it more than 10 years later. And then it took several years, but slowly but surely, suddenly it got made, and then it did well at a film festival, and then it got on HBO, and it looks like this big, amazing Hollywood movie, but it actually was a lot of people working hard behind the scenes for a very long time. It was exciting, and I was not a part of it at all. I just sort of watched as it happened. And with Lost Girls, it was optioned before the time of streaming. It was 2013, before Serial or Making a Murderer or anything like that. And so they thought of it as a feature, not as a big series. And it bounced around everywhere. And I had no control over it, and I just had to trust that they wouldn't do something ridiculous. This is a story that has no killer at the end. The case is still unsolved. And I was worried that they would come back and say, listen, we've realized we can't make this movie unless we create a fake ending with a killer where the mystery is solved. And I would have had no control over that because I had just trusted them and had them option it. And all I could do is disavow the movie, I guess, and move on with my life. But they didn't. They stayed very true to the themes of my book, which was really wonderful, and I'm very grateful for that. But each time this happens, it's very different. And sometimes it seems like the studios are just buying things so that they can have insurance because they're going to make a movie about it anyway, and they just want the story so that they can claim that they have the authoritative version of what happened.
Bueno, si publicases Lost Girls.
Well, if we published Lost Girls today, I mean, every single platform would try to have it, because this is the story that is trendy right now, and this is what the producing companies are looking for. And in the case of this book, would you like to see it on the big screen? On the big screen, I guess that maybe you have already talked to some people, but do you really think that it would be something positive for the story?
I see a lot of potential for a mini-series about this, one that's long, like 10 episodes, that can go into everybody's point of view the way that the book does. But it would need to treat mental illness as something realistic. It would need not to have ridiculous dream sequences or special effects or CGI or anything like that. It needs to do what the book did, which is to keep everything firmly grounded and compassionate. And there's very dark stuff in this book. There's abuse and a murder-suicide. So that's going to make it a big no for a lot of places. But perhaps there is someone out there who would be interested, and I'd be eager to see what happens.
Bueno, por mi parte.
Well, so I was going to say that I have no more questions. I have them, but as far as we're running out of time, I would like the audience to take the floor. I would like to take this minute to see if anybody wants to ask anything. Yeah, we have a couple of hands there. Hello, good afternoon. Well, thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to ask you, from the medical point of view, your work has been useful in order to get to know this disease, schizophrenia.
Yes, it's very exciting to be able to work on a story that isn't just an amazing, oh my goodness, why did this happen story, but it also is an excuse to research something that's a very intimidating subject. So that people who might never have picked up a book about this subject now might suddenly learn more about it because they have the family story as a way in. And that was really one of the goals. A scary goal for me because I had to understand it too. Thank you for your question.
Es una buena pregunta, la tenía que haber.
It's a good question. I should have asked it. Good afternoon. I'm curious. When gaining that trust, did you live with the family, or did you live close to them, or you just went there for a day to interview them?
I would fly to Colorado and be there for 3 or 4 days at a time to visit various people. And then I would come back as often as necessary to see other people and other people and other people. So over the course of reporting, I probably made 8 trips like that. And then, of course, I was on the telephone with everybody all the time in between, long conversations on the phone. So it was a mixture of in-person and telephone. And visits to hospitals to search through for medical records. That there was a lot of that as well. Thank you.
¿Más preguntas?
More questions? Good afternoon. Hello, Robert. Thank you very much for this presentation. Well, I've read the book, and I have to say that it shows that the fact of having a good story is not only important, it is very useful. It is very important to be able to tell it, and the narrator that gives voice to the family is really valuable. I've loved it. I'd like to ask you about this Gablin sisters, because I think it's quite curious the way they have to take responsibility over their schizophrenic brothers and siblings. I would like to know if you have felt like if you had to give up, if they were forced to take responsibility of them because of a gender matter. We have healthy siblings that don't want to know anything about it, even from medical stuff. So, well, this is my question, basically. Thank you.
I think that it is gendered, and I see it in lots of families who I know personally, including my family. My father is elderly and lives in Baltimore, and my older sister lives in Baltimore too, and so she's the point person more often than I am. I see him, but I'm not the one who's really making sure he's okay. And the brothers who might be candidates to do some of the things to help out, they come in from time to time, but they really aren't the main point of contact. And these days, Margaret, one of the sisters, she's created some distance. She might help financially or might help in certain ways, but she doesn't want to be the one who gets called anymore. So it ebbs and flows. My big question, as I said before, was why did they, you see in the book, the sisters went through terrible moments in their childhood. So why would why weren't they so soured on the experience that they would never want to come back? And the story starts with a young girl, the youngest, Lindsay, who really despising her brother, and it ends with her caring for him and being devoted to him and championing him and feeling a kinship with him and being angry that our society doesn't do more to help people like him. So how does someone make that change? To me, that was interesting. But the more everyday occurrence is that it's the girl who winds up taking care. And actually, my wife too has an elderly mother, and she's the girl. She's looking after her mother.
¿Alguna pregunta más?
So, any more questions? No? Okay, oh yeah. Yeah. I'd like to ask you if you honestly believe after this book that there's no discrimination towards people that have mental illnesses, or that this discrimination has been reduced towards these people, and if this fear has disappeared, the fear that we have towards mental illnesses, and maybe your book could contribute for this fear to increase, because I haven't read the book, by the way, but it seems that these schizophrenic people do terrible things, but there are people that with the right treatment have a regular life, a normal life. So that would be my question.
I do believe there is a stigma now about severe mental illness. If I have any optimism at all, it's that in the preceding decades, the stigma for other mental health conditions has decreased for things like anxiety or bipolar disorder or depression. And I guess you could include autism in this category. People talk about it more now. It's less of a stigma. But for schizophrenia, there is still an incredible fear and stigma. And this family and others are suffering in part because of that. And I hope the book humanizes the people who are schizophrenic. But I also hope that it I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. It doesn't just, I hope that the book doesn't just make families feel more comfortable, but that it also influences pharmaceutical companies to be more motivated to do more to treat people, and perhaps inspire families to come out of the shadows, because one of the problems this family had is that it lived in secret for too long. Once the boys got treatment, this is what I remember now, once they got treatment, the violent episodes and the difficult moments ended. And so getting treatment is important, and it can't happen if you're living under a stigma and living in secrecy. I worried about this issue when starting the book. I said, I don't want a monster movie. I don't want a book about people who are being cruel to one another. And so I was very sure to make sure that while I certainly try to do justice to the scary moments the family experienced, I don't make that the end of the story. I make that the beginning of the story, and then what happens after that to everyone involved and how they process that trauma becomes part of the story as well.
Bueno, pues
Great. So well, I meant, I don't know if you want to wrap up with something, or we can give you a very big round of applause.
I'd say that the book came out during the pandemic, and I was not predicting that we all would be suffering so much, or that there would be so much loss of life or so much trauma that we all were experiencing together. And I don't think that this book is necessarily I don't want to make big claims about this book, but I do think that sometimes we read stories of people going through difficult things, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, so that we can sort of process it in a safe space. We can look at what the other people went through and we can ask ourselves, what would I have done? How would I have felt? What would it be like? And I think that might be one reason why the book was well received during the pandemic. And I couldn't have predicted that. I thought perhaps that because it was such a sad time, people wouldn't have wanted a sad book. But in fact, people were using this sad book and many other books and stories to process what they were going through. And this is an unexpected privilege. So I'll just stop there.
Bueno, pues nada, yo agradezco.
So, well, thank you very much to the publishing house for publishing this book in Spain. I think that it was really necessary. Thanks for the invitation to the presentation. And, well, Bob, thanks for your trust. Thanks for your invitation. And thanks for this amazing work that is your book. So I think that a very big round of applause for Bob. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now Robert is going to sign some books, so if you have your books with you and he wants you to sign them, he will be at your disposal at the lobby. Thank you.